All right, let me try to finish this up, I guess, or I don't know, I'll see how long it goes. Um, so the Romans, you know, about 2,000 years ago, same time as they were conquering the Jewish people and, um, you know, genociding them, basically destroying their temple in Jerusalem. They were also butchering the Celtic people. They basically genocided all the Druids. And, they got control of England. And England basically, like, I think at that time there was not really like a division between Scotland and England per se. There was not a political division or a cultural division really. There was the kind of Pictish culture seemed to be throughout much of Britain. But it's hard to be fully sure about that. But all we know is that, the Romans got control of England, and that included Wales. Basically, England was Wales at that time. The Welsh are the natives of England who were kind of pushed off. Like Wales is like a basically native reservation for the people that used to have the whole country. But the Picts up north in Scotland were maybe could have been a mix of Welsh and maybe other people from England who had fled from the Romans, and together with people that were native to Scotland, including the Caledoni, which was a nation that I think was in the northeast, maybe near like Aberdeen or something, up in that general region. But they basically gave the Romans a run for their money. They kept raiding the Romans like just constantly. I think they probably just saw them as invaders and terrorists, and so probably some of the Northerners were from England, so they were getting revenge and they were kind of defending their homeland in England. But then there were others that were either raiding them to keep them out of Scotland or teach them a lesson, or just to take their gold and take their stuff. And so there were constant raids from the north, and eventually a wall was built all the way across the island of Britain, or at least I think all the way across, by I believe it was first the Hadrian's Wall by Emperor Hadrian, and it was just built to just keep the Picts, keep the Caledonians and stuff from, raiding them and just, totally making things very difficult for the Romans in England, shall we say. Just constant raids. So they built this Hadrian's Wall, massive undertaking, very expensive, huge wall, fortified wall. Like, so this is like the Great Wall of China type of wall, where like it has like regular turrets, each of which like has a guard posts, and it was a massive undertaking. Basically, the most massive thing that the Romans did in Britain was just to build this thing to hide from the Picts, and it didn't work because the Picts just raided the wall. Because then they sent all these garrisons to the wall, and then that was just like the Picts were like, okay, now we know where they all are, all these soldiers, and stuff. They're all on this wall, so we'll just raid the wall and take all their weapons, take all their armor and everything. So they just kept raiding the wall. They'd break through or go past the wall. So then the Romans had a new idea that they would put a new wall further north, as like somehow that would help it to be another further frontier buffer zone. So they put the I think that was the Antonine Wall, I think. So maybe that was Emperor Antonine or something, Antonine Wall. So that was even further north. That was, I'm not sure if it was north of Edinburgh, but it was inside modern Scotland. So it was especially kind of blocking off the Highlands and the north, where like the northeast, where the Caledonia were. So they built that, another massive undertaking, and then that failed too. And then the Picts raided that wall, and then they just raided them both, raided everything, raided England. So yeah, because the Romans, they probably wanted to conquer Scotland too, but I just think it wasn't in the cards for them. I'll just say whatever allowed them to conquer England and the rest of these places was not going for them when it came to Scotland. So, and some could argue that maybe they didn't want Scotland, that Scotland was less fertile and worse climate, etc. But chances are they did want, they wanted everything. They wanted the world. They wanted, Northern Europe. So, and yeah, so the people of Scotland gave them a run for their money, and that resistance against Roman encroachment and Roman imperialism is what created Scotland, in the sense that that's what put the kind of political division between what we now know as England. I mean, this was before the Anglo-Saxons or the Angles set foot there, but that's basically, you could say, the origin of Scotland as a distinct country was the resistance of the Picts against the Romans. And I think also the Scots also resisted the Romans. I'm not sure if there were Scots in Scotland yet, but essentially at that time, Scotland, Scotia meant Ireland, and the Scots, Scot meant Irish. So the reason Scotland became known as Scotland is because there was essentially an Irish part of Scotland, and I think it's called Dalriada. It was called Dalriada. It was basically the same geographical region as Argyllshire, which is the kind of Western Highlands. And so they came, I'm not sure when Dalriada was established. I think they say that it was established, about 2,000 years ago, or maybe it was like 500 or maybe it was a few hundred AD, but or it could have always been there to some extent. I mean, the general mythology is that the Scots came from Ireland, came from northeastern Ireland, to Western Scotland and basically conquered and colonized and took over. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Gaelic people, because the Scots and the Irish are Gaelic-speaking Celts, as opposed to the Welsh, who are a different type of Celt. Their language is different. Maybe, I don't know if it's called Gaelic, but Gaelic, I don't. Maybe it's Gaelic and versus Gaelic. I don't know. But all I know is the Irish are Gaelic, and like the kind of standard mythology is that the Gaels came to Britain, in maybe a couple hundred AD when these Scots came from northeast Ireland to Argyllshire and established Dalriada. But there's a lot of archaeological and other evidence to suggest that that they were already there in western, like along the western coast of Britain, and it may have been that the Irish Sea was essentially its own culture on both sides, both coasts. And certainly that, like the Isle of Man, is Gaelic, like Manx or Monks or however you say that is a Gaelic tongue, and that's in the Irish Sea as well. So, and it may have been also populated quite early and maybe into very prehistoric times. So it's hard to know when the Gaels actually came to Scotland. They may have always been there. Scotland may even have been where they came from. Maybe that was how they got to Ireland. Maybe they came from Argyll. It's hard to know. But all we know is that some of the Scots, either from Ireland or from Scotland or both, were also raiding the Romans along with the Picts. And eventually the Roman Empire fell, and the Scottish kingdom there is called Dalriada, and it basically merged with the Picts eventually to expel the Vikings, who had eventually became like a major problem. There was the Celts became Christianized by, there was St. Patrick. I think there were some earlier than St. Patrick, but St. Patrick is the most famous and maybe the most important in terms of Christianizing Ireland. And he, I think it may be that the most common belief is that he was from Scotland. I think he might have been Roman, from like maybe a Roman part of Scotland, maybe when there was only maybe when the Antonine Wall was up, so maybe lowland Scotland was technically Roman at that time, so that he may have been from like southwestern Scotland. But he Christianized a lot of the Irish, and then like there was an Irishman who was named Columcille, I guess. It was Columcille or Colum, yeah. He was from Northern Ireland, from Ulster, and he I think he was descended from Druids, but he was a Christian, and he was like expelled from Ireland for like fighting with somebody or something like that. He fell ran afoul of the authorities, was exiled, and he settled across the Irish Sea. And or no, what did he do? So like, yeah, Dalriada was already there. So what he did was settle in the island of on the island of Iona, which was basically part of Dalriada, but it's in the Irish Sea, like off the western coast of Scotland, off the western coast of Argyll. And he set up a monastery there, and basically began training monks or whatever they were, and teaching literacy and Christianity, and translating books, and maybe reproducing books to preserve. So that was like a major center that became a major center of Celtic Christianity and of world Christianity. And then people like, I think all the kings of Dalriada were buried, or most of the early kings of Dalriada were buried there on Iona. The Iona people basically Christianized them, because I think they were still basically mostly pagan at that time. And then the Dalriada people, probably, soon included a lot of the Iona people soon included a lot of the Dalriada people, because they probably sent a lot of their own sons to be trained there. And then the Iona people fanned out to other places, and they established, I don't know if it was Lindisfarne or something, or basically there's an island off the, I believe, the east coast of northern England, which was established like another monastery, basically established by the Iona monks, the Iona Christians, as a place to teach and Christianize the Anglo-Saxons who lived there in northern England by that time. But then the Vikings came in and basically totally destroyed Iona, stole all the gold, stole all the relics and everything, totally destroyed Lindisfarne, or whatever the Anglo-Saxon island was. And they established Dublin, I guess, and they just took over probably Orkney and a lot of the islands and coasts of the British Isles. So the people of Dalriada saw this as obviously existential threat, so they joined together with the Picts, to basically say either we're going to join together or we will be no more. So they formed an alliance and they merged their kingdoms. I think it was that the Dalriada people had a patrilineal kingship. It went down through the male line, and the Picts had a matrilineal kingship or rulership that went down through the female line. So the king of Dalriada married like the queen or princess of the Picts, and then therefore their offspring would be the heir apparent of both kingdoms. And that's how kind of Scotland as we know it was created. Scotland as more than just Argyll, basically more than just Dalriada. And I think they also joined with the Strathclyde people, who might have been a kind of British, basically either Welsh or similar to the Welsh language, people who lived along the Clyde River, basically just to the south of Argyll, just to the south of Dalriada, on the west coast there. And so they established Scotland. And I guess, let's see, where should I go from there? They, a lot of people came into Scotland, Normans, Anglo-Saxons, basically English people, Flemish people, French people, probably Dutch people, all kinds of people came to Scotland. It was considered to be a premier destination for like the second sons of royals and nobility and stuff, because they could carve out some kind of empire there, and so a lot of the major powerful families were established by powerful European families from different origins, but they also did in many ways assimilate into a common Scottish culture. That's the difference between England and Scotland, where in England, like, the Romans took over, and then the Anglo-Saxons took over, and then the Normans took over. In Scotland, like, all these populations were there. I mean, there were probably even a lot of descendants even of Romans in Scotland, but none of them took over. At least none of them successfully took over. The Romans tried to take over, and the Anglo-Saxons tried to take over, and the Normans tried to take over, probably. But I mean, even the Normans, they didn't exactly try to take over the same way, like, except for the ones that ruled England. But the ones who actually settled in Scotland actually helped resist English rule. So it's been, in that sense, it was a somewhat diverse country. But, a lot of those were kind of the leaders of, these powerful families or whatever. But I think the vast majority of Scots, just like the vast majority of English, most of their DNA is from Neolithic and maybe Bronze Age times, but I think especially Neolithic. So most of, despite all the influx, the majority of the actual ancestry remained fairly constant. And so Scotland, eventually merged with England. Scotland was hugely influential in the world from early times. I mean, like, Iona was very influential in the world, and there was a lot of kind of overlap between that and Scotland. I mean, it was part of Scotland, but it was also kind of Irish. And there was a lot of confusion because the people from Iona tended to always be known as Scots, even though a lot of them were from Ireland. And even people who just came direct from Ireland, studied in Iona, and then went on to Europe, the continent, they were referred to as Scots because that was the name for the Irish. And then it eventually became the name for Scotland because, like, when it was just Dalriada there, I think Dalriada was called Scotia Minor, but it may have been that by the time of the consolidation, when Dalriada merged with Pictland and Strathclyde, that they it may have been that by that time the name Scotland had ceased to be current, and that basically at that time, like, instead of being Scotia Minor, it just became Scotia, and that Scotia, which was Ireland, became known as under other names. I think particularly Hibernia, maybe Hibernicus, or I guess Hibernia. and maybe Ayr, or whatever, Ireland, Erin. So it still is Scotland. I mean, Ireland is Scotland technically, and Scotland is like Scotland Junior, or, I'm not sure what the size difference is between Scotland and Ireland, or if there is much of one, but I'm guessing Scotland's a little bit smaller. So that's how Scotland became Scotland. And but it was very influential. I mean, there was a lot of confusion between who the Scots referred to, because the Scots were just very legendary. The Scots being the Irish and the Dalriadans, probably. But certainly the Irish, they were renowned as scholars. It was at a time when the Roman Empire had fallen and had been, it had fallen to the Vandals and basically Germanic tribes and nations that were not literate, at least, in the Roman, Latin, Greek way. So a lot of the civilization that the Romans had built up based on that form of literacy in Europe basically was destroyed and died out after the Roman Empire fell, but it was carried on in Ireland. And there were a lot of books that were translated in Ireland and preserved, a lot of rare texts, rare Bibles, rare religious and classical texts. And so a lot of people went out from Iona, the monastery at Iona, to Europe and went all through, Germany and France and probably different parts of Europe, basically re-Christianizing those places, or sometimes maybe for the first time Christianizing them. So, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint exactly, but it seems that the Irish and probably with the help of the Dalriada people and other people of Scotland, were very influential in spreading Christianity and literacy through Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. So and then the people from Scotland traveled a lot. Like a lot of them settled in Ireland. A lot of them settled in France, and I'm not sure, early on. I know that a lot of them early on went to Ireland and were the Galloglasses, the soldiers and bodyguards for the Irish clans, and they were there in mostly in Northern Ireland, especially Northeastern Ireland, for since maybe the 1300s or something, probably at least since the time of the Bruces. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, and his brother Edward the Bruce, who became King of Ireland by basically mounting a campaign against the English there, and that Edward, may have helped to establish the Galloglass tradition, if indeed it didn't already exist there. But they were also, at least I know by the 1600s, the Scots were going all through Europe, and they were renowned as scholars in France and in all throughout Europe. They were kind of, I don't know, it seemed like they almost formed a sort of global elite of professionals and go-getters, scholars, and especially merchants, like and traders, like peddlers, tradesmen. And from what I've read, and there could, unless this is the wrong, a mistaken etymology, but from what I've read, in almost every country in Europe, the name for a peddler, somebody who goes town to town peddling wares, whatever, selling stuff, is basically a Scot. Like there's, I think, Scots Koopman or something, maybe in Germany. Like every country in Europe had like a different version of the same word, but they all seem to derive from basically like anybody who sells stuff is basically just called a Scot, because that's what the Scots did. They were kind of ubiquitous throughout the world as peddlers. They were also ubiquitous as soldiers. A lot of the leading armies of Europe during the 1600s were led by Scots. I think the army of Russia was led by a Scot. The army of Sweden was led by a Scot during the time when it was actually very successful. Army of I think Portugal, like they were generals, and they often married into the royalty and the aristocracy of a lot of these countries. And there were a lot of Scottish university professors in France, in probably Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. Like they were just a very influential immigrant group throughout Europe. Like Immanuel Kant is a German, philosopher who's descended from Scots. Let's see, I think some had theorized that the most kind of high up Russian person before the revolution was a Scottish descended person named like Campbell or something, that possibly might have been a Campbell. But like Marie Antoinette in France, she was having an affair with I don't know what his name was, like Roland something, or whoever the guy was, like basically an aristocrat from somewhere in Europe, and he was descended from these Scots as well. Like a lot of the elites of Europe, and especially the professionals of Europe, were descended from Scots. And I mean, this seems like the Scots, or at least certain branches of the Scots, were just renowned for being highly educated. So they kind of were an advanced guard of civilization, you could say, like wherever they went. So they were all over the place. There was a lot of them in Poland. There was a lot of them in Russia. I think Catherine the Great wanted to marry one of her Scottish generals, and it like almost like brought down the monarchy. And so yeah, I don't have all the details of that type of stuff on the tip of my tongue, but if you research Scots in Europe during the 15, 16, 1700s, I think there's a lot of very amazing stuff. Then in 17 I think it was in 1704 or maybe 1707, 1703. Anyway, early 1700s was the Act of Union. So like the union of the crowns between Scotland and England, when the Scottish king James the Sixth became king of both places. Like, he inherited the English crown as well, because basically England was Protestant and all the other people in line for the throne were Catholic, and James had been raised Protestant by the Scottish reformers who had overthrown his Catholic mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and given her to the English, who had imprisoned her and maybe killed her. But therefore, James had been raised Protestant, and so he was chosen, to be King of England. So this is the James that we know from, like, the King James version of the Bible, and because that was early 1600s, like 1604 or something. That was the Union of the Crowns that basically said that henceforth the Scottish royalty is the English royalty. It's one thing. It didn't change anything else technically that I know of about Scotland or England. So technically the rest of their constitutions remained the same. They just shared a king. So they still had their own parliament. Scotland had a parliament. England had a parliament. But, in practice, it tended to be that, like, basically James went down to England and, like, never came back. He's like, peace. Because he was basically done with Scotland. Like, the Scots didn't care for monarchy in any real sense. They didn't believe in being bossed around by one person, or by anybody. So, they had overthrown his mother, and they had tried to indoctrinate him to be a liberal and to be, not be authoritarian, but didn't really work. So anyway, there was growing antagonism, and his son Charles then tried to really force the Scots to become like a colony of England and to become a mini England, and so they rose up against him, and again gave him over to the English, who killed him. And so it was in 1707 maybe that there was an active union between actual Scotland and England. So basically they merged as countries, and they merged their parliaments together, and in some ways it gave the Scots enviable leverage, because probably not initially, but at least eventually, like right now, I think in a lot of ways, or at least, maybe a decade or two ago, like before Alex Salmond and Scottish nationalism's success, like the Scots had basically disproportionate power in the British Parliament. But at the same time, they have relatively little power overall because they don't have their own government. So in some ways it can be bad for both, because the English are outvoted by the Scots. Like, the Scots tend to have like an outsized say in Britain's affairs, and the Scots don't have complete control over any government. They're only a small minority, even with their outsized say. So I understand the push towards nationalism, but part of the upshot of the union of England and Scotland is that, I mean, that's where we get, or at least that's where the first Union Jack came from. Like the Union Jack was originally the St. Andrew's cross, which is a white X on blue background.